The kitchen lamps flickered to life with a soft pop, one after another, as Molly Weasley moved through the room with her wand raised. Golden light spread across the worn wooden counters, pooled in the dents and scratches of the old table, and glinted off the mismatched plates stacked beside the sink. Outside, the September sun was sinking below the orchard, casting long shadows through the window. But inside the burrow, warmth had already taken hold. Molly set her wand on the counter and turned to the stove, where 3 pots were stirring themselves in lazy circles. The largest one, potato and leek soup, sent up clouds of steam that smelled of butter and thyme. She lifted the lid on the second pot, nodded at the carrots bubbling inside, and left the third alone. The bread had already been pulled from the oven and sat cooling on the sill, the crust golden and cracked in all the right places. She wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at the clock. The Weasley family clock was an old, ungainly thing, its face crowded with 9 hands and no numbers at all. Instead of hours, it had locations: home, work, school, traveling, prison, hospital, mortal peril. Most of the hands were pointing to home now, clustered together like a bouquet. Arthur, Ron, Ginny, George. Percy had visited last Sunday, and his hand had swung back to work at the ministry. Monday morning, Bill and Fleur were at Shell Cottage. Charlie's hand pointed to travelling. Romania, probably, though he hadn't written in a fortnight. One hand no longer moved at all. Molly looked at it for a moment, then turned back to the stove. The stairs creaked overhead. Not the usual self-adjusting creak of the burrow's enchanted steps, rearranging themselves for convenience, but the deliberate human sound of someone coming down. A moment later, Ginny appeared in the doorway, her hair pulled back in a loose tie, sleeves rolled to her elbows. "Need help?" she asked. "Set the table, love," Molly said. "Your father should be home any minute." Ginny moved to the cupboard and began pulling down plates. The house was quieter than it had been in years. No Fred and George shouting over experimental explosions. No Percy reciting ministry memoranda at breakfast. No Bill teasing Charlie about dragons. Even Ron had moved out last month, though he still came back for dinner 3 times a week. Tonight, it would just be the 4 of them: Molly, Arthur, Ginny, and George. George, who spent most of his time at the shop. George, who came home to sleep and not much else. Ginny set the last plate down and looked at her mother. "Has he come down yet?" "Not yet." "Should I?" "Leave him," Molly said gently. "He'll come when he's ready." Ginny nodded and stepped back. She knew better than to push. The back door opened, and Arthur Weasley stepped inside, bringing with him the smell of autumn air and parchment. He was still wearing his ministry robes, though he'd loosened the collar, and his hair, thinner now than it had been before the war, was slightly mussed from the evening wind. He carried his briefcase in one hand and a folded piece of parchment in the other. "Evening, dear," Molly said, glancing up. "You're late." "Bit of paperwork," Arthur said. He set the briefcase down by the door and crossed the kitchen to kiss her cheek. "Smells wonderful." "It's only soup." "Best soup in Britain," Arthur said, and Molly smiled despite herself. He moved to the table and set the parchment down, smoothing it flat with one hand. Ginny noticed it first, the official ministry seal pressed into dark red wax at the top, the neat, formal script beneath. "What's that?" she asked. Arthur hesitated. "Just a notice. Nothing to worry about." Molly turned from the stove. wooden spoon still in hand. "Arthur," he sighed and gestured to the parchment. "New ministry policy. Post-war regulations. They're auditing protective enchantments on all registered magical properties." "Auditing?" Molly stepped closer, frowning. "What does that mean?" "It means," Arthur said carefully, "that for a short period, 3 days in our case, all enchantments and wards around the Burrow will need to be temporarily removed so they can assess structural integrity, verify that nothing dark was placed during the war, that sort of thing." Ginny stared at him. "They're taking down the wards?" "Just for 3 days," Arthur said. "Friday to Sunday. A ministry official will come to remove them, then return to restore them. It's all very standard." "Standard," Molly repeated. She set the spoon down on the counter. "Arthur, the house—" "I know. The stairs, the supports, the roof—" "I know," Arthur said again, quieter this time. "But it's not optional. Every home with registered enchantments is going through the same process. The Lovegoods, the Diggories, even Muriel." Molly closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and nodded. "When?" "They'll be here Friday morning. Dawn, most likely." There was a long pause. From somewhere above, the ghoul in the attic let out a low, rattling groan. The stairs creaked again, still rearranging themselves, still adjusting for footsteps that hadn't come yet. "Well," Molly said finally, "I suppose we'd better prepare then." Arthur watched her for a moment, then nodded. "We'll manage. We always do." Ginny looked between them, then down at the parchment. The ministry seal gleamed dully in the lamplight. Upstairs, a door opened. George appeared on the landing, one hand on the railing, his face carefully blank. He'd heard them talking. Molly could tell from the way he stood, too still, too quiet. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just looked at Arthur. "Ministry audit," Arthur said simply. 3 days without enchantments. George raised an eyebrow. "No magic?" "No enchantments," Arthur clarified. "You can still use your wand. The house just won't help." "Right." George came down the rest of the stairs, moving past them to the table. He glanced at the parchment, then at the stove, where the pots were still stirring themselves. "Guess we'd better enjoy this while it lasts then." He said it lightly, but there was something else beneath the words. Something Molly couldn't quite name. She turned back to the stove and began ladling soup into bowls. They ate quietly that evening. The soup was good, thick and savory, with chunks of potato soft enough to melt on the tongue. But no one said much. Ron had sent word he'd be staying at Harry and Hermione's for the week, helping them settle into Grimmauld Place. Percy was working late. It was just the 4 of them at the table, and the spaces between felt larger than usual. Ginny asked about Arthur's day, and he told her about a memo that had gone missing in magical maintenance, only to turn up in the Department of Mysteries 3 floors down. George mentioned a new product idea, something involving self-inking quills and true serum, but didn't elaborate. Molly talked about the garden, how the tomatoes were finally ripening, how she'd need to can them before the first frost. Normal things, safe things. But every so often, one of them would glance at the parchment, still sitting at the edge of the table. After dinner, Ginny washed the dishes by hand. Molly had asked her to, though she didn't say why. George disappeared upstairs without a word. Molly sat at the table with a cup of tea, watching the clock. All the hands still pointed to home. Arthur stepped outside. The evening air was cool and still, the sky deepening to indigo above the orchard. He walked slowly around the perimeter of the house, his wand held loosely in one hand. The protective wards were invisible to most people, but Arthur had been maintaining them for so long, he could almost see them. Faint shimmers in the air, like heat rising off summer pavement. He stopped at the front corner of the house, where the wards were anchored to an old stone marker buried in the ground. The magic here was old. Some of it had been cast by his father, some by his grandfather, layers upon layers of protection woven so tightly into the burrow that the house had come to depend on them. Arthur had reinforced them during the war, strengthened them after Voldemort fell, checked them every week since, and now, for 3 days, they would be gone. He stood there for a long time, wand raised, watching the shimmer fade as the last of the daylight slipped away. Somewhere in the orchard, an owl called. The wind moved through the tall grass, whispering. Arthur lowered his wand. "It's only 3 days," he said aloud, to no one in particular. The house creaked behind him, settling into the evening. He turned and walked back inside. Molly was still at the table when he came in. She looked up, and he saw the question in her eyes. "It'll be fine," he said. She nodded. "Of course it will." Neither of them moved. Upstairs, the ghoul let out another long, rattling groan. The kitchen lamps flickered slightly, their enchantments humming softly in the background. The family clock ticked. The house leaned gently to the left, just as it always had, held upright by magic that had been there so long no one thought about it anymore. Arthur crossed the kitchen and sat down beside Molly. She reached for his hand, and he took it. 3 days, she said quietly. 3 days, he agreed. They sat together in the warm, golden light, listening to the familiar sounds of the burrow around them. The self-sweeping broom whispered across the floor in the hallway. The dishes clinked softly in the sink, washing themselves. The stairs rearranged with a gentle thunk. All of it would stop soon, but not yet. For now, the house still hummed with magic, and the Weasleys were home. Molly squeezed Arthur's hand once, then let go. She stood, collected the teacups, and set them in the sink. Arthur watched her move through the kitchen, practiced, efficient, graceful in the space she'd inhabited for decades. "We should get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow will be busy." Arthur nodded and rose from the table. He folded the parchment carefully and tucked it into his pocket. Out of sight, but not forgotten, they climbed the stairs together, stairs that shifted helpfully beneath their feet, adjusting for Molly's shorter stride, smoothing out the uneven rises. At the top of the landing, they paused. George's door was closed. A thin line of light showed beneath it. Molly looked at it for a long moment, then turned away. In their bedroom, Arthur changed into his nightclothes and sat on the edge of the bed. Through the window, he could see the orchard, dark now, except for the faint glow of enchanted fairy lights strung between the trees. Those would go too, he realized. Everything would. Molly climbed into bed beside him and extinguished the lamp with a flick of her wand. In the darkness, Arthur could still hear the house around them, the hum of protective charms, the whisper of cleaning spells, the distant groan of the ghoul, comfortable in its attic. "Arthur," Molly's voice was soft. "Yes? It really will be fine, won't it?" He thought about the wards, old and strong. He thought about the house, leaning and crooked and held together by magic. He thought about his family, scattered and changed, and still finding their way back to each other. "Yes," he said, "it will." Molly moved closer, her head resting against his shoulder. And in the quiet of the burrow, with magic still humming through the walls, they fell asleep. Outside, the wards shimmered faintly in the starlight. By Friday, they would be gone. Molly woke to silence. Not the comfortable silence of early morning, when the world was still gathering itself for the day. Not the gentle quiet of snow falling or mist settling over the orchard. This was a different kind of silence, a hollow, waiting emptiness that pressed against her ears. She opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling. The house wasn't moving. For as long as Molly had lived at the Burrow, the house had been in constant, subtle motion. The stairs rearranged themselves throughout the night. The walls settled and shifted, adjusting to temperature and occupancy. The protective wards hummed a frequency so low it was more felt than heard. Even the ghoul provided a rhythmic, rattling comfort from the attic above. Now there was nothing. Molly sat up slowly. Beside her, Arthur was still asleep, his breathing deep and even. The bedroom looked the same as it always did, the wardrobe listing slightly to one side, the mirror on the dresser reflecting the pale pre-dawn light from the window, the rag rug worn thin in the center. But it felt different, heavier somehow, more present. She slipped out of bed and crossed to the window. Outside, the orchard was grey with morning mist, the trees standing motionless. No fairy lights glimmered between the branches. The garden gnomes, usually darting between the vegetable beds or hiding under the rhubarb, stood perfectly still near the fence, as if they'd forgotten how to move. Molly pressed her hand against the window pane. The glass was cold. She dressed quietly, pulling on her everyday robes and tying her hair back with practiced efficiency. Arthur stirred, but didn't wake. She left him sleeping and made her way to the door. The landing was dim, the familiar enchanted sconces dark and cold. Molly reached for her wand automatically, then hesitated. The lamps would still light. Arthur had explained that personal magic would still work, that it was only the enchantments woven into the house itself that would be removed. But something made her pause. She descended the stairs in darkness. Each step creaked beneath her weight. Not the helpful, adjusting creak of stairs making room for her, but the plain, honest sound of old wood bearing load. The risers were uneven. The third step from the bottom wobbled slightly. Molly had to steady herself on the railing that didn't warm to her touch, didn't lean into her hand the way it usually did. The kitchen was grey with early light. Molly stood in the doorway, looking at the room she'd inhabited for decades, and felt like a stranger. The stove was cold. The pots sat exactly where she'd left them the night before, unwashed, unmoving. The dishes were still stacked in the sink. The broom leaned against the wall in the corner. Bristles splayed and still. Even the air felt different, stale, motionless, without the gentle circulation of temperature-regulating charms. Molly crossed to the table and sat down. The family clock hung on the wall above her, its 9 hands frozen mid-swing. Some pointed to home, some pointed to nothing at all, caught between locations, suspended in the moment the enchantments had stopped. Molly looked at Fred's hand, still motionless, still pointing to nothing, and felt her throat tighten. She looked away. Outside, the sky was beginning to pale. Dawn would come soon, and with it, The ministry, official who would formalize what had already begun. Molly stood, crossed to the stove, and stared at it. She'd cooked on this stove for 30 years. She knew every burner, every temperamental knob, every hot spot and cool corner. But she'd always cooked with magic, temperature charms, auto-stirring spells, timers that chimed in her mind when something was ready. Now, looking at the plain iron surface, the unlit burners, the ordinary, mundane fairness of it, she felt a flutter of something uncomfortably close to panic. She took a breath and reached for the knob. It turned stiffly. She heard the hiss of gas, smelled it faintly in the air. She lit her wand, Lumos, and held it to the burner. The flame caught with a soft whoomp, blue and yellow and startlingly bright in the grey kitchen. Molly stared at it for a moment, then set a kettle on to boil. By the time Arthur came downstairs, she'd managed tea and toast. The toast was slightly burnt on one side, pale on the other, and the tea was weak, but it was something. Arthur accepted his cup without comment and sat down across from her. "They'll be here soon," he said quietly. Molly nodded. They drank their tea in silence, waiting. The knock came just as the sun broke over the orchard. Arthur rose and crossed to the door. Molly followed, her wand tucked into her apron pocket, her hands clenched at her sides. The ministry official was younger than Molly had expected, a woman in her mid-20s with neat brown hair and nervous eyes. She wore formal robes and carried a leather case under one arm. A silver badge gleamed on her collar. Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Property Regulation Division. "Mr. and Mrs. Weasley?" she said. Her voice was polite, apologetic. "I'm Audrey Whitmore. I'm here for the enchantment audit." "Of course," Arthur said. He stepped back and gestured her inside. "Please come in." Audrey entered carefully, looking around the kitchen with the expression of someone trying very hard not to seem judgmental. Molly felt a flash of defensiveness. The dishes were still in the sink. The stove was smoking slightly. The whole room probably looked shabby and chaotic to someone used to ministry order. But she swallowed it down. "I'll need to perform a full assessment," Audrey said, setting her case on the table and opening it. Inside were rolls of parchment, a quill, several vials of shimmering liquid, and a long silver instrument that looked like a tuning fork. "It shouldn't take more than an hour. I'll remove the enchantments in stages, document everything, and provide you with a receipt for reinstatement." "We understand," Arthur said. Audrey pulled out the tuning fork and tapped it against the table. It rang with a clear, high note that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. She moved through the kitchen slowly, holding the fork in front of her, watching the way the air shimmered and bent around it. "You have quite a few active enchantments," she said, making notes on her parchment. "Temperature regulation, self-cleaning, structural reinforcement, pest deterrence." She paused near the stove. "Is that a perpetual flame charm?" "Was," Arthur said. "It's already gone, I think." Audrey nodded and made another note. She moved to the doorway and looked up at the stairs. "I'll need to assess the upper floors as well, the attic particularly. There's a significant concentration of magic up there." "The ghoul," Molly said quietly. "Ah." Audrey smiled faintly. "Yes, those tend to be enthusiastic." She climbed the stairs, and Arthur and Molly followed. Ginny's door was still closed. She was still asleep, or pretending to be. George's door was open, the room empty. He'd left early. probably gone to the shop before anyone else was awake. Audrey worked methodically, room by room, tapping her tuning fork and making notes. In Molly and Arthur's bedroom, she paused near the wardrobe. This has a spatial expansion charm. Very old work. Beautiful, actually. Arthur's grandfather, Molly said. I'll need to remove it, Audrey said apologetically. You may want to take some things out first. It'll shrink back to its original size. Molly stared at the wardrobe that held 30 years of clothes, linens, extra blankets, all of it folded neatly in a space that shouldn't have been able to hold half as much. She nodded numbly and began pulling things out, stacking them on the bed. When the wardrobe was empty, Audrey raised her wand and spoke a quiet incantation. The air around the wardrobe shimmered, then contracted. The doors pulled inward slightly. The whole piece seemed to shrink, just a little, but enough that Molly could see the difference. It looked smaller, ordinary. They continued to the attic. The ghoul had lived in the Burrow's attic for as long as anyone could remember. It was a fixture, as much a part of the house as the crooked walls and the leaning chimney. It groaned and rattled and threw things, and the children had grown up half terrified and half fond of it. Now it sat in the corner, perfectly silent, watching them with wide, unblinking eyes. Audrey approached it carefully. I'm not removing the ghoul itself, she said. Just the containment wards that keep it from wandering. It should stay put on its own, but you may want to keep the attic door closed. Right, Arthur said. Audrey raised her wand. The air around the ghoul shimmered and faded. The ghoul blinked once, then settled back into the corner and closed its eyes. It didn't make a sound. By the time they returned to the kitchen, Ginny was awake and standing by the stove, staring at the burnt toast. She looked up when they entered, her expression carefully neutral. Morning, she said. Morning, dear, Molly replied. Audrey completed her assessment in the kitchen, then moved outside to the perimeter wards. Molly, Arthur, and Ginny stood in the doorway, watching as she walked slowly around the house, her wand tracing patterns in the air. This is strange, Ginny said quietly. It's only 3 days, Arthur said. I know, but it's still strange. Molly said nothing. She watched Audrey circle the house, watched the faint shimmer of the wards flicker and fade, and felt something twist in her chest. When Audrey finished, she returned to the kitchen and handed Arthur a roll of parchment sealed with red wax. That's your receipt, she said. I'll return Sunday evening to restore everything. In the meantime, the house is, well, it's just a house. No enchantments, no wards, no magical assistance of any kind. You'll need to manage everything manually. We understand, Arthur said. If you have any issues, structural problems, anything dangerous, send word to the ministry immediately. We'll dispatch someone. Thank you. Audrey nodded, gathered her case, and turned to leave. At the door, she paused and looked back. It's a lovely home, she said quietly. Really, you've taken good care of it. Then she was gone. The door closed behind her, and the three of them stood in the kitchen, listening. The house was completely silent. No hum of protective wards, no whisper of cleaning charms, no creak of self-adjusting stairs. The ghoul didn't groan. The clocks didn't tick. Even the air felt still, heavy, waiting. Ginny crossed to the sink and turned on the tap. Water spluttered out, cold and uneven. She stared at it. Well, she said, I suppose we'd better figure out how to do the washing up. Arthur managed a smile. I'll fetch some firewood. We'll need it for the stove." He left through the back door, and Molly and Ginny stood together in the kitchen, looking at the dishes piled in the sink. "Mum," Ginny said quietly. "Yes? Are you all right?" Molly looked at her daughter, strong, capable Ginny, who'd fought in a war and survived and was still here, still asking if her mother was all right. "I will be," Molly said. She picked up a dishcloth and handed another to Ginny. Together, they began to wash the dishes by hand. Outside, the Burrow settled. Not the gentle, magical settling it had done for decades, but the real, physical settling of old wood and stone adjusting to new weight. The house creaked. A board groaned. Somewhere upstairs, something shifted. The Burrow leaned a little further to the left, and inside, the Weasleys began to learn what their home felt like without magic holding it together. Molly stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in soapy water that had gone lukewarm 10 minutes ago. Through the window, she could see the garden, rows of cabbages and runner beans, the potato patch near the fence, the herb spiral Arthur had built years ago that listed perpetually to one side. The garden gnomes stood motionless among the vegetable beds, watching her with their small, beady eyes. They hadn't moved all morning. She pulled another plate from the sink and scrubbed at it with a dishcloth. Her hands were already red and pruned, the skin tight across her knuckles. She'd forgotten how much work washing dishes by hand actually was, how the water cooled too quickly, how her back ached from standing, how each plate required real attention, real effort. Behind her, the kitchen table was covered with breakfast debris, burnt toast, lumpy porridge that had scorched on the bottom because she'd turned away for just a moment, tea that had gone cold in the pot. Arthur had eaten without complaint. Ginny had managed a few bites, and George hadn't come down at all. Molly set the clean plate in the drying rack and reached for another. The back door opened, and Arthur stepped inside, carrying an armload of firewood. His face was flushed, his breathing slightly labored. He dumped the wood into the box beside the stove and straightened, pressing one hand to his lower back. "That's the third load," he said. "Should be enough for today and tomorrow." "Thank you, dear," Molly said. Arthur crossed to the sink and stood beside her, looking out the window. "The fence in the east paddock is leaning," he said. "I noticed it when I was out by the woodshed. The reinforcement charm must have been holding it up. Can you fix it?" "I think so. I'll need nails, probably, and a hammer." He paused. "Do we have a hammer?" Molly thought about it. "In the shed, maybe." "Arthur, when was the last time you used a hammer?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. They looked at each other, and despite everything, Molly felt a smile tug at the corner of her mouth. Arthur smiled back, tired and wry. "We'll manage," he said. "We always do," Molly replied. But she wasn't sure she believed it. By mid-morning, the house had begun to feel foreign in small, accumulating ways. The stairs didn't adjust when Molly climbed them, and she stumbled twice on the uneven risers. The bedroom was cold, genuinely cold, without the temperature regulation charms that had kept it comfortable year-round. The floorboards creaked, in places she'd never heard them creak before, and twice she thought she heard something shift in the walls, some structural settling that made her pause and hold her breath. The house was old. She'd known that, of course, but magic had always smoothed over the truth of it, had held the crooked walls straight, and kept the sagging roof from sagging too far. Now, without it, the burrow felt fragile in a way that made Molly's chest tighten. She found Arthur in the garden, kneeling by the fence with a box of nails and a hammer he'd unearthed from the back of the shed. He was trying to drive a nail into one of the fence posts, but the wood was old and hard, and the nail kept bending. "Damn," he muttered, pulling the bent nail free and tossing it into the grass. Molly had never heard him swear at carpentry before. "Would you like some help?" she asked. Arthur looked up, his face sheepish. "I can't seem to get the angle right. I keep thinking I should just—" He gestured vaguely with the hammer. "A reparo would fix this in seconds." "But we can't," Molly said gently. "No," Arthur agreed. "We can't." He selected another nail and positioned it carefully against the post. This time, he managed to drive it halfway in before it bent. He sighed and sat back on his heels. "I used to know how to do this," he said. "When I was a boy, before Hogwarts, my father had me help with repairs around the house. I remember the feel of it, the rhythm, but I've been using magic for so long." He trailed off, looking down at the hammer in his hand. "I don't remember how to just do things." Molly knelt beside him and took the hammer. "Let me try." She positioned a nail and struck it firmly. The nail sank a quarter-inch, then held. She struck again, and slowly, carefully, drove it flush with the wood. Her arm ached by the time she finished, but the nail was in, and the fence post was a fraction more stable. Arthur stared at her. "How did you—" "My father was a muggle," Molly said quietly. "I grew up doing things by hand." She'd forgotten that, almost. Forgotten the years before Hogwarts, when magic was a secret thing she wasn't supposed to do. When chores meant scrubbing and sweeping and hauling water from the well. She'd left that life behind so completely that it felt like someone else's memory. But her hands remembered. She handed the hammer back to Arthur. "Firm grip, straight strikes. Don't overthink it." He nodded and tried again. This time, the nail went in cleanly. They worked together for the next hour, barely speaking. Just the rhythm of hammer strikes and the creak of old wood. When they finished, the fence was stable. Not perfect, not straight, but standing. Arthur stepped back and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "That took forever," he said. "Yes," Molly agreed. "Magic would have—" "I know." They looked at each other, and Arthur's expression softened. "I'm sorry," he said. "I keep saying that, don't I? I keep comparing." "We all do," Molly said. Inside, Ginny was sweeping the kitchen floor, actually sweeping, with the broom that usually did the work itself. She'd already swept twice, but the floor was still gritty with tracked-in dirt and crumbs. The broom didn't know which corners to focus on, didn't adjust its bristles to reach under the table. It was just a stick with straw on the end, and Ginny had to think about every stroke. Ron arrived just after lunch, stepping through the kitchen door with Hermione at his side. They stopped in the doorway, looking around the kitchen with matching expressions of surprise. "Blimey," Ron said. "It's quiet." "No enchantments," Ginny said, still sweeping. "Ministry audit. Didn't Mum tell you?" "She mentioned it," Ron said. "But I didn't think." He looked up at the family clock, frozen and silent. "That's weird." Hermione moved to the sink, where the morning's dishes were still stacked in the drying rack. "You've been washing these by hand?" "We don't have much choice," Molly said. She was at the stove, trying to coax heat from the temperamental burners. "Would you two like some tea?" "I'll make it," Hermione said quickly, and set to work filling the kettle. Ron crossed to the table and sat down heavily. How long is this supposed to last? 3 days, Molly said. Sunday evening, they'll restore everything. And until then, we manage. Ron looked around the kitchen again, at the cold stove, the dark sconces, the plain, unenchanted ordinariness of it all, and shook his head. I don't know how muggles do it. Carefully, Hermione said from the sink, and with a great deal of patience. Ginny stopped sweeping and leaned on the broom. It's strange, isn't it? You don't realize how much magic does until it's gone. Everything takes 3 times as long, Molly said. Cooking, cleaning, just everything. Arthur appeared in the doorway, his hands smudged with dirt, his robes dusty from the garden. Ron, good. I could use your help with something. What's that? There's a loose board on the back step. I need someone to hold it steady while I nail it down. Ron blinked. You're using nails? Unless you would like to try wandless magic, Arthur said dryly. Ron stood and followed his father outside. Hermione and Ginny exchanged glances. Then Hermione carried the kettle to the stove and set it on the burner that Molly had finally managed to light. Mrs. Weasley, Hermione said carefully, are you all right? Molly turned from the stove, startled. Of course, dear. Why do you ask? You seem... Hermione hesitated. Tired. Molly looked down at her hands, red and chapped, the nails rimmed with soap and dirt. She felt tired, bone-tired, in a way that had nothing to do with physical work and everything to do with the constant, low-level awareness that the house was fragile, that everything required more effort, that the comfortable rhythms she'd relied on for decades were gone. It's only 3 days, she said, quietly. But as she said it, she felt something crack inside her chest, something small and hairline thin, but there nonetheless. She turned back to the stove before Hermione could see her face. Outside, Arthur and Ron worked on the step, their voices low and companionable. Inside, Hermione and Ginny set the table for tea. The kettle began to whistle, shrill and ordinary, and Molly lifted it from the burner with a kitchen towel wrapped around the handle. She poured the tea into mismatched cups and carried them to the table. They sat together, Molly, Hermione, Ginny, and drank in silence, listening to the sounds of the house around them. A creak from upstairs, a gust of wind rattling the windows, the faint tap of hammer against wood from outside. No hum of magic, no whisper of charms, just the house, bare and honest and more present than it had been in years. It's like the house is breathing differently, Ginny said suddenly. Molly looked at her. What do you mean? I don't know. It's just louder somehow. Like we can hear things we couldn't hear before. Hermione tilted her head, listening. The structure, she said. Without reinforcement charms, it's bearing its own weight. You're hearing it settle. Is that safe? Ginny asked. It stood this long, Molly said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. They finished their tea in silence. Ron and Arthur came back inside, the step repaired, both of them looking pleased with themselves in a quiet, satisfied way. Ron washed his hands in the sink. The water was still cold. The heating charm was gone, and dried them on a towel. We should get going, he said to Hermione. Harry's expecting us for dinner. Of course, Hermione said. She stood and carried her cup to the sink. Thank you for the tea, Mrs. Weasley. Any time, dear. Ron hugged his mother, then Ginny, then followed Hermione to the door. He paused on the threshold, looking back at the kitchen. It really is quiet, he said. Yes, Molly said. Will you be all right? We'll be fine, Arthur said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Ron nodded and stepped outside. The door closed behind him, and the kitchen was quiet again. Molly stood at the sink and looked out the window. The afternoon light was slanting golden across the garden, pooling in the spaces between the vegetable beds. The gnomes had finally started moving again, just a little, shuffling slowly from one spot to another, as if they'd forgotten how to run. She thought about the fence, held together now by nails instead of magic. She thought about the step, repaired by hand. She thought about the dishes in the drying rack, the cold floors, the silent clocks. 3 days. It was only 3 days. But standing there, her hands red and aching, her back sore, her chest tight with something she couldn't name, Molly wasn't sure how they would last even that long. Behind her, Arthur touched her shoulder gently. "Come sit down," he said. "You've been on your feet all day." Molly let him guide her to the table. She sat, and he sat beside her, and they looked at the kitchen together, at the cold stove, the dark lamps, the frozen clock. "I miss it," Molly said quietly. "I miss the magic." Arthur took her hand. "I know. Not just because it made things easier, because it made this place feel alive." "It's still alive," Arthur said. "We're still here." Molly nodded, but she wasn't sure she believed that either. Upstairs, a door opened. Footsteps crossed the landing, slow, deliberate. George finally emerging. He came down the stairs carefully, one hand on the railing, and appeared in the kitchen doorway. His hair was uncombed, his clothes rumpled, his eyes shadowed. "Evening," he said. "Evening, dear," Molly said. "Are you hungry?" George looked at the stove, at the cold pots, at the dishes still stacked by the sink. "Not really," he said. "I think I'll just—" He gestured vaguely toward the back door. "All right," Molly said. George crossed the kitchen and stepped outside. Through the window, Molly watched him walk toward the orchard, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the evening wind. He didn't come back until after dark, and when he did, he went straight to his room without a word. Molly and Arthur sat at the kitchen table long into the evening, a single candle burning between them, listening to the house creak and settle around them. The first day without magic was over. 2 more to go. Arthur woke before dawn, pulled from sleep by a sound he couldn't identify at first. He lay still in the darkness, listening, and slowly realized what it was. The house, groaning. Not the comfortable settling he was used to, the gentle adjustment of magical beams and self-repairing joints, but a deep, wooden complaint. The sound of old timber bearing weight it hadn't borne in decades. A creak from the floor above, a soft groan from somewhere in the walls, the faint whisper of wind finding gaps in the window frames that warming charms usually sealed. Beside him, Molly slept on, her breathing steady and slow. Arthur slipped out of bed carefully, pulled on his dressing gown, and padded barefoot to the door. The landing was cold. His breath misted faintly in the air. He moved to the top of the stairs and looked down into the darkened house, listening. Another creak. This one from the kitchen, or perhaps the sitting room. The whole structure seemed to be conversing with itself, a slow dialogue of stress and response that Arthur had never heard before, because magic had always done the translating, the mediating, the quiet work of holding everything together. He descended the stairs slowly, testing each step. Some were solid. Others gave slightly under his weight, flexing in ways that made his heart quicken. When he reached the bottom, he stood in the hallway and looked around. In the dim pre-dawn light, the burrow looked smaller, shabbier. The wallpaper was peeling near the ceiling. The floorboards were visibly warped. The door frame to the kitchen leaned inward at an angle that should have been alarming. Without magic, his home looked like what it was, an old house held together by luck and habit and the stubborn refusal to fall down. Arthur crossed to the kitchen and stood in the doorway. Everything was where they'd left it the night before. Dishes in the drying rack, cold stove, dark lamps. The family clock hung silent on the wall, its hands frozen. Through the window, the sky was beginning to pale, the first suggestion of morning spreading across the orchard. He thought about lighting a lamp, starting the stove, beginning the day's work. But instead, he just stood there, looking at the kitchen he'd eaten breakfast in for 30 years, and felt something shift in his chest. He'd built a life here, raised 7 children in this crooked, leaning house, fought a war from this kitchen table, buried a son, and returned to this same 4 walls because there was nowhere else to go. And he'd done all of it assuming the house would hold, assuming magic would keep it standing, assuming he could just keep going, keep moving forward, keep solving the next crisis without ever stopping to ask if the foundation itself was sound. Now, standing in the cold kitchen with no magic humming in the walls, Arthur wasn't sure. He sat down at the table and put his head in his hands. "Arthur?" He looked up. Molly stood in the doorway, wrapped in her dressing gown, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked young in the dim light, and tired, and something else he couldn't name. "I didn't mean to wake you," he said. "You didn't. The house did." She crossed to the table and sat down beside him. "It's so loud now." "I know." They sat in silence, listening to the structure settle around them. A beam groaned overhead. The floorboards creaked. Somewhere upstairs, a door rattled in its frame. "I've been thinking," Arthur said quietly, "about how I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "Be a father when there's nothing to fix, no crisis to solve, no emergency to manage." He looked down at his hands, calloused and ink-stained, and starting to show their age. "During the war, I knew what to do. Keep everyone safe, keep everyone together, keep moving. But now," he trailed off. Molly was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You think I know how to be a mother without a disaster to manage?" Arthur looked at her. "I've spent 30 years cooking and cleaning and organizing," Molly continued, her voice steady but strained, "making sure everyone was fed and clothed and loved. And I told myself that was enough, that if I just kept doing those things, if I just kept the house running and the family fed, then everything would be fine." She paused. "But it wasn't enough, was it? We still lost—" Her voice broke. Arthur reached for her hand, and she gripped it tightly. "I keep thinking about how close we came," she whispered, "to losing everyone. Not just Fred. All of them. You, Ron, Ginny, Bill, Charlie, Percy, George. I came so close to standing in this kitchen alone with no one left to feed. But we didn't," Arthur said. "We're still here." "I know, but I can't stop thinking about it. And without the magic, without the noise and the movement and the constant distraction of keeping this place running." She looked around the kitchen, her eyes bright. "I can't stop hearing it. The silence where Fred should be, the empty spaces." Arthur pulled her close, and Molly pressed her face against his shoulder. She didn't cry, not quite, but he felt her breathing change, felt the tension in her body as she fought to hold herself together. "I don't know how to just be," she said, "without something to do, without a crisis to manage." "Neither do I," Arthur admitted. They held each other in the cold kitchen as the sun rose slowly over the orchard, painting the walls with pale gold light that did nothing to warm the room. Upstairs, a door opened. Molly pulled back and wiped her eyes quickly. "That'll be Ginny. I should start breakfast." "Molly?" "I'm all right," she said. She stood and crossed to the stove, her movements brisk and practiced. "Really, I'm all right." But Arthur could see the way her hands shook as she lit the burner. Ginny came down a few minutes later, already dressed, her hair pulled back in a practical braid. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene, her mother at the stove, her father at the table, the strange, heavy silence of the house around them. "Morning," she said carefully. "Good morning, dear," Molly said, too brightly. "Porridge all right for breakfast?" "Fine," Ginny said. She crossed to the table and sat down across from Arthur. Under the table, her foot tapped a restless rhythm against the floor. Arthur watched her for a moment. "Trouble sleeping?" "A bit. The house is so loud now." "We were just saying the same thing." Ginny nodded. She looked around the kitchen, her expression thoughtful. "It's strange. When the magic was here, everything felt busy, like the house was always doing something. But now it's quiet, and I can hear all the things I wasn't hearing before." "Like what?" Arthur asked. Ginny was quiet for a moment. "Like how empty it is," she said finally. "How many people aren't here anymore?" Molly's hand stilled on the wooden spoon. "Bill and Fleur have Shell Cottage," Ginny continued. "Charlie's in Romania. Percy's got his own flat now. Ron's at Grimmauld Place with Harry and Hermione. Fred is—" She stopped, swallowed. "Gone. And George is here. But he's not really here. He's just upstairs." "George is going through a difficult time," Molly said quietly. "I know, but so are we. And we're all just—" Ginny gestured vaguely. "We're all just pretending we're fine, pretending the house isn't emptier, pretending we're not all walking around each other, afraid to say the wrong thing." Arthur looked at his daughter, fierce, honest Ginny, who'd fought in a war and refused to pretend it hadn't changed her. "You're right," he said. Ginny blinked. "What?" "You're right. We are pretending." He glanced at Molly, who had turned from the stove to look at him. "We're all so busy trying to keep moving, trying to keep things normal, that we're not being honest about how hard this is." Molly set the spoon down slowly. "Arthur, I'm terrified," Arthur said. The words came out flat and factual, but they hung in the air like a confession. "All the time, I'm terrified that I don't know how to be a father now that the war's over, that I only know how to protect you all from external threats. But I don't know how to help with the internal ones, the grief, the loss, the ordinary, impossible work of just living." Ginny stared at him. Molly's hand had moved to her mouth. "And I'm afraid," Arthur continued, looking at Molly, "that we're going to spend the rest of our lives in this house, moving around each other, trying so hard to be strong that we forget how to be honest." The kitchen was completely silent. Then Molly said, very quietly, "I'm angry." Arthur and Ginny both looked at her. "I'm so angry," Molly continued, her voice trembling. "At Voldemort, at the Death Eaters, at the Ministry for not stopping it sooner, at myself for not being able to protect everyone, At Fred for... She stopped, pressed her hand harder against her mouth. At Fred for leaving, for dying, for not being here when I need him. Her voice broke on the last word. Ginny stood and crossed to her mother, wrapping her arms around her. Molly held her tightly, and this time she did cry. Not the quiet, restrained tears of someone trying to stay strong, but the raw, gasping sobs of someone who'd been holding back for too long. Arthur rose and joined them, and for a long moment, the three of them stood together in the cold kitchen, holding each other while Molly wept. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and her eyes were red, but she looked somehow lighter. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," Ginny said firmly. I should be stronger. I should be able to—" "Mum," Ginny interrupted. "You held us together through a war. You're allowed to fall apart a little now." Molly let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and wiped her eyes. "I don't know how to fall apart." "None of us do," Arthur said. "But maybe that's all right." They stood together in the morning light, the house creaking around them, and for the first time in months, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. Upstairs, a door opened, footsteps on the landing, slow and hesitant. George appeared at the top of the stairs, looking down at them. His hair was disheveled, his face pale, and he had one hand braced against the wall, as if he needed the support. "I heard," he said quietly. "Everything. The walls are thin without the soundproofing charms." Molly's face flushed. "George, I didn't mean—" "It's all right," George said. He came down the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. When he reached the bottom, he stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at them with an expression that was carefully, painfully neutral. "You're right. I have been hiding upstairs." "You're grieving," Arthur said. "That's different." "Is it?" George crossed to the table and sat down heavily. "Because it feels like hiding. It feels like I'm avoiding all of you. Because if I come down here, if I sit at this table, I have to be here, in this house, without him." He looked up at the family clock, at Fred's hand frozen in place. "Every room in this house has him in it," George said. "Every corner, every chair. The stairs where we used to ambush Percy, the landing where we tested products, the attic where we hid from Mum." His voice was flat, factual, but his hands were shaking. "He's everywhere, and he's nowhere, and I don't know how to exist in both of those truths at the same time." Molly moved to sit beside him. She didn't touch him, didn't try to comfort him, just sat there in quiet solidarity. "I keep thinking about the shop," George continued, "about how I have to go back on Monday and run it alone, about how every customer is going to ask where Fred is, and I'm going to have to explain it again and again, and—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "And I don't think I can." "You don't have to," Ginny said. "I do, though. The shop is his legacy, our legacy. If I close it, if I walk away, then what was the point of any of it?" "The point," Arthur said carefully, "is that you're still here, and you get to decide what comes next." George looked at him, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "What if I don't know what comes next?" "Then you don't know," Arthur said, "and that's all right too." They sat together in the quiet kitchen, Arthur, Molly, Ginny, and George, and for the first time since Fred's funeral, no one tried to fill the silence with platitudes or reassurances or false hope. They just sat and listened and let the truth of their grief exist without trying to fix it. Outside, the sun climbed higher. The orchard brightened. The garden gnomes shuffled slowly between the vegetable beds, finally remembering how to move. And inside the burrow, stripped of magic and pretense, the Weasleys began to speak the things they'd been too afraid to say. It wasn't healing. Not yet. But it was honest. And for now, that was enough. Morning light fell through the kitchen windows in plain, honest squares, pooling on the worn floorboards without shimmer or enchantment. Molly stood at the counter, her hands buried in a mound of bread dough, kneading with a rhythm she'd almost forgotten she knew. Push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. The repetition was soothing in a way she hadn't expected. Her shoulders ached slightly, and flour dusted her forearms up to the elbows. But there was something satisfying about the physical work. The way the dough resisted at first, then gradually softened under her hands, becoming smooth and elastic and warm. She'd made bread by hand as a girl, before Hogwarts, in her mother's kitchen. But at some point over the decades, she'd stopped. The enchanted bread tin had been easier, faster, more reliable. Set the ingredients in, speak the charm, and 20 minutes later, perfect bread, every time. This bread wouldn't be perfect. The oven temperature was uneven, the dough probably overworked, her timing more guess than precision. But it would be hers, made by her own hands, and somehow that mattered more than she'd realized. Behind her, Arthur sat at the table with a Muggle newspaper he'd bought from the village shop yesterday. He'd discovered the crossword puzzle on page 7 and had been working at it with intense concentration, a pencil clutched in his hand, his reading glasses perched on his nose. 7 letters, he muttered. Device for regulating temperature. Starts with T. Thermostat, Molly said without looking up. That's 8 letters. No, dear. THERMOSTAT. 7 letters. Arthur counted on his fingers, then let out a small laugh. So it is. Brilliant. He penciled it in carefully, looking pleased with himself. Molly smiled and continued kneading. Through the window, she could see George and Ron in the garden, working on the fence that had started leaning again overnight. They'd been out there for an hour, barely speaking, just passing tools back and forth in comfortable silence. Ron had come back this morning, alone. Hermione was helping Harry with something at Grimmauld Place, and had taken one look at the fence before rolling up his sleeves without being asked. George had appeared a few minutes later, looking hollow-eyed and tired, but present in a way he hadn't been since Friday. They were replacing the post now, digging new holes by hand, their movements slow and methodical. Molly watched them work and felt something ease in her chest. The house creaked overhead, not alarmingly, just the ordinary sound of old wood settling. Molly had stopped flinching at every noise yesterday afternoon. Once she'd realized the burrow wasn't actually going to collapse. It was just adjusting, learning to bear its own weight again. She shaped the dough into a round loaf and set it in the greased pan to rise. It would take an hour, maybe more, without magic to speed the process. She covered it with a clean cloth and set it near the warmth of the stove. Molly, Arthur said, not looking up from his crossword. Have we always had this much time? She turned to look at him. What do you mean? This. He gestured vaguely around the kitchen. Quiet mornings, nothing urgent happening. Time to just sit. Molly thought about it. I suppose we must have. But I don't remember them. Neither do I. Arthur set down his pencil and removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. We were always so busy. 7 children, then the war, then the aftermath. Always something that needed doing. Someone who needed feeding or healing or protecting. That's what parents do, Molly said. I know, but I wonder if we forgot how to just be together without a crisis to manage. Molly dried her hands on her apron and crossed to the table. She sat down beside him, looking at the half-finished crossword, the careful penciled letters in Arthur's neat handwriting. Are you saying you like this? She asked carefully. The house without magic? Arthur was quiet for a moment. No, he said finally. I miss it terribly. The convenience, the comfort, the way it made everything feel safe. He paused. But I think I needed this. To slow down. To notice things I'd stopped noticing. Like what? He looked at her, really looked at her, in a way that made her suddenly self-conscious. Like how beautiful you are when you're kneading bread. Like how Ron and George work together without needing words. Like how the house sounds when it's just being a house. Molly felt her throat tighten. Arthur, I'm not saying I want to live like this forever, he continued, but I think I've been moving too fast for too long, and I didn't realize it until the magic stopped and I had to actually pay attention. Molly reached for his hand. He took it, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm. Outside, Ron called something to George. George responded. Molly couldn't hear the words, but she heard the tone. Light, almost teasing. The first hint of humor she'd heard from him in months. She squeezed Arthur's hand. 2 more days, she said softly. 2 more days, he agreed. And somehow, the thought didn't bring relief anymore, just a strange, bittersweet ache. By afternoon, Ginny had joined her brothers in the garden. She'd brought out a basket of tools and a determination to fix the gate that had been sticking for years. The 3 of them worked together, arguing good-naturedly about the best approach, occasionally dissolving into the kind of sibling bickering that felt comfortingly normal. Molly made tea and carried it out to them on a tray. Plain tea, in mismatched cups, without a single enchantment to keep it warm. But when she set it down on the garden bench, and they all stopped work to drink, wrapping their hands around the cups and standing together in the autumn sunshine, it felt like something precious. Mum makes good tea, Ron said, as if this were a revelation. I've been making tea for 30 years, Molly said, amused. Yeah, but usually it's magical tea. Self-brewing, stays hot forever, all that. This is just tea. And it's really good. Ginny rolled her eyes. It's the same tea, Ron. No, it's not. It's better. He took another sip, thoughtful. Maybe because we're actually stopping to drink it instead of just gulping it down while doing 12 other things. George was quiet, turning his cup in his hands. Then he said, Fred would have made a joke about that. Something about how tea tastes better when you're not fighting dark wizards. The garden went still. It was the first time George had said Fred's name out loud since Friday morning. Ron and Ginny exchanged glances. Molly held her breath. George looked down at his tea. He would have liked this, I think. The house without magic. He always said the enchantments made everything too easy, that we'd forgotten how to actually do things. He paused. He was probably right. He usually was, Ginny said quietly. George smiled, small and sad, but genuine. Yeah, he was. They stood together in the garden, drinking their tea, letting Fred's presence settle among them, without trying to push it away or pretend it wasn't there. When they finished, they went back to work on the gate, and this time, When George handed Ron a screwdriver, he said, "Fred would have enchanted this to do the work itself." "Absolutely," Ron agreed. "And then it would have gone rogue and started unscrewing everything in the house." Ginny laughed. "Remember when he enchanted the spoons to stir themselves, and they ended up conducting a symphony with the cookware?" "Mum was furious," George said, and for the first time in months, there was warmth in his voice when he spoke about his twin. Molly listened from the kitchen window, her hands still again in dishwater, and felt tears slip down her cheeks. But they weren't the heavy, choking tears of yesterday. These were gentler, sadder, but somehow lighter. She let them fall and didn't try to hide them. In the late afternoon, a barn owl arrived with a letter from Harry. Ginny brought it inside, unfolding the parchment with a smile. "He's asking how we're managing," she said, scanning the letter. Hermione told him about the audit, and he's worried we're all starving or freezing or something. "Tell him we're fine," Molly said from the stove, where she was monitoring the bread. "I will." Ginny sat down at the table and pulled out a sheet of parchment. She dipped a quill in ink, the regular kind, not the self-inking enchanted variety, and began to write. Molly glanced over her shoulder. "Writing by hand. The enchanted quills are all unchanted, I suppose." Ginny flexed her fingers. "It's strange. I haven't written a whole letter by hand in ages. My handwriting's terrible." "It's perfectly fine," Molly said. Ginny smiled and continued writing. Molly watched her for a moment. Her daughter bent over the parchment, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration, the way she had when she was 10 years old, doing homework at this same table. The oven timer dinged, an actual mechanical timer Arthur had found in the back of a drawer, not a charm. Molly pulled the bread from the oven, and the kitchen filled with the smell of fresh-baked crust, warm and yeasty and utterly ordinary. "Oh, that smells amazing," Ginny said, looking up. "It's just bread." "It's brilliant bread." Molly set the loaf on the counter to cool and felt an absurd swell of pride. It was just bread. She'd made thousands of loaves in her lifetime, but this one, made by hand, without magic, with all her attention and effort, felt different, special. She cut a thick slice once it had cooled slightly and spread it with butter. She handed it to Ginny, who took a bite and closed her eyes. "Definitely brilliant," Ginny said. Arthur came in from the garden, his clothes dusty, his face flushed from physical work. "Is that fresh bread?" "Just finished," Molly said. He crossed to the counter and broke off a piece, eating it standing up, savoring it. "This is the best bread you've ever made. Don't be silly. I'm serious." He took another piece. "There's something about it. I can taste the effort, the care." Molly felt her cheeks warm. "It's not perfect. The crust is uneven, and I probably overworked the dough." "It's perfect," Arthur said firmly. Ron and George came in a few minutes later, drawn by the smell. They stood around the counter, all 5 of them, eating warm bread with butter and not talking about anything important. Just being together. Just being. Evening came slowly, the light turning golden as the sun sank toward the horizon. They worked together to prepare dinner. Vegetable soup, leftover bread, apples from the orchard. It took 3 times as long as it would have with magic, and the soup was a little too salty, but no one complained. They ate on the porch, sitting on the old wooden bench and the mismatched garden chairs Arthur had dragged out from the shed. The air was cool, but not cold, and the light was beautiful, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. No one suggested going inside. They sat together, listening to the sounds of the evening, birds settling in the orchard, wind moving through the grass, the distant sound of the village church bell ringing 6 o'clock. "This is nice," Ron said eventually. "Yeah," Ginny agreed. George didn't say anything, but he didn't leave either. He sat with them, his eyes on the orchard, his expression distant but not entirely closed. Molly looked around at her family, at Arthur beside her, at her 3 youngest children scattered on the porch, at the breadcrumbs on their plates, and the cups of tea growing cold in their hands. The burrow still leaned, the floorboards still creaked, the house still groaned and settled, and made sounds that worried her. But sitting here, in the gentle evening light, with her family around her and no crisis demanding her attention, Molly felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace, not the absence of pain, not the erasure of grief, but a quiet, settled sense that despite everything, despite the war and the loss and the still raw wounds, they were here, together. And for this moment, that was enough. The sun touched the horizon, spilling red gold light across the garden. Molly watched it sink slowly, and for the first time since the enchantments were removed, she didn't dread the coming of night. She just sat with her family, breathing in the cool evening air, and let the almost comfortable ache of it all settle into her bones. Tomorrow was Sunday. Tomorrow evening, the ministry official would return and restore the magic. But for now, in this quiet moment, Molly was content to just be here, in this house, with these people, without magic to distract her from how much it all meant. The knock at the door came precisely at dawn, just as it had 3 days ago. Molly was already awake. She'd been lying in bed for the past hour, listening to the house creak and settle, memorizing the sounds. The groan of the floorboards in the hallway, the whisper of wind through the gaps in the window frames, the honest, unadorned reality of wood and stone holding themselves together through nothing but friction and habit. She slipped out of bed and dressed quietly. Arthur stirred but didn't wake. Downstairs, she found George already in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of tea, staring at the frozen family clock. "Couldn't sleep either?" Molly asked softly. George shook his head. "Wanted to hear it one more time, the quiet." Molly understood. She crossed to the window and looked out at the garden, grey in the pre-dawn light. The fence they'd repaired stood straight. The gate hung properly on its hinges. Small victories, won with their own hands. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Molly went to the door and opened it. Audrey Whitmore stood on the threshold, looking exactly as she had 3 days ago. Neat brown hair, nervous eyes, formal robes. But this time, she carried a different case, and her wand was already in her hand. "Mrs. Weasley," she said with a polite nod, "I'm here to restore the enchantments." "Of course," Molly said, stepping back. "Please, come in." Audrey entered, setting her case on the kitchen table. George watched her warily, his hands wrapped around his teacup. Upstairs, Molly heard Arthur moving around, then footsteps on the stairs. "This shouldn't take long," Audrey said, opening her case and pulling out a long scroll of parchment covered in tiny script. "I'll be working from the documentation I made on Friday. Everything should be restored exactly as it was." "Right," Molly said. She felt Arthur's presence behind her, his hand settling gently on her shoulder. Audrey tapped her wand against the parchment, and it began to glow faintly. "I'll start with the structural reinforcements. You'll feel the house shift, probably. It's quite normal." She raised her wand and spoke a long, complicated incantation in a language Molly didn't recognize. The air in the kitchen began to shimmer, thickening with magic that hadn't been there moments before. And then the house moved. It wasn't dramatic. No great cracking or groaning, no sudden lurch, just a slow, subtle lifting, as if the burrow were taking a deep breath after holding it for 3 days. The floorboards straightened slightly. The door frame to the kitchen pulled itself square. The walls, which had been leaning perceptibly to the left, eased back toward vertical. Molly felt it through the soles of her feet, the house settling into its magical posture, reassuming the shape it had held for decades. Arthur's hand tightened on her shoulder. "That's the main structural supports," Audrey said, making a note on her parchment. "Now, the temperature regulation." Another incantation and warmth began to spread through the room. Not the gradual, hard-won warmth of a fire carefully tended, but instant, even heat that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Within seconds, the chill that had permeated the house for 3 days was gone. George set down his teacup and stood, moving to the stairs. Molly followed him with her eyes. "The stairs are next," Audrey said. She spoke another charm, and Molly heard the familiar thunk of the steps rearranging themselves, adjusting to their enchanted configuration. The uneven risers smoothed out. The wobbling third step from the bottom went solid and steady. Ginny appeared on the landing, her hair sleep-mussed, wrapped in a dressing gown. She paused halfway down the stairs, and Molly saw her expression shift as the steps moved beneath her feet, adjusting their height, accommodating her stride. "It's coming back," Ginny said quietly. "Yes," Molly replied. Audrey worked methodically, moving through her list. The lighting charms came next, the sconces flickering to life one by one, filling the house with warm golden light that needed no flame, no oil, no tending. The kitchen lamps glowed. The hallway brightened. Even the upstairs landing, which had been dim and shadowy for 3 days, became welcoming again. Then the protective wards. Audrey went outside for this, and Molly, Arthur, Ginny, and George followed, standing in the garden as she walked the perimeter of the house. Her wand traced patterns in the air, and slowly the familiar shimmer began to appear, faint at first, then stronger, a barrier of magic settling into place around the burrow, like a blanket being drawn up. Molly had always found the wards comforting. They meant safety, protection, a boundary between her family and the dangers of the world. But now, watching them reappear, she felt something else too, a sense of separation, of distance. The house was being wrapped in magic again, insulated from the ordinary world. And part of her, a small, unexpected part, mourned the loss of that rawness, that honesty. They went back inside. Audrey restored the cleaning charms next, and immediately the house began to tidy itself. The dishes in the drying rack floated to the cupboard and arranged themselves neatly. The broom in the corner stood up and began sweeping the floor with brisk, efficient strokes. Dust motes that had been settling for 3 days lifted and swirled toward the door, swept away by invisible currents of air. The self-maintenance enchantments, Audrey said, consulting her parchment. Pest deterrence, moisture control, wood preservation. She worked through them quickly, her wand moving imprecise, patterns. Arthur walked to the stove. He turned a knob, and the burner lit instantly, perfectly, without any fuss. He stood looking at it for a long moment, then turned it off again. "Everything all right, Mr. Weasley?" Audrey asked. "Yes," Arthur said. "Just checking." Molly knew he was lying. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his hand lingered on the knob. He was saying goodbye to something, the same thing she was saying goodbye to. Audrey moved to the family clock. "This one's a bit delicate," she said. "Very old magic, very personal. I'll need complete silence for this." They all stood still, watching. Audrey raised her wand and spoke a soft, almost whispered incantation. The air around the clock shimmered, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft tick, the clock came to life. The hands swung into motion, all of them except Fred's, which remained frozen. But the others moved smoothly, reorienting themselves. Arthur, Molly, Ron, Ginny, George, Percy, Bill, Charlie. One by one, they swung to point at home. The clock began to tick, its familiar rhythm filling the kitchen. Molly watched George staring at it. His hand had moved unconsciously to his chest, pressing against his sternum as if something hurt there. Fred's hand didn't move. It would never move again. But the clock was alive again, tracking the living, keeping count of who was safe and who was home. "Just a few more," Audrey said gently. "The garden enchantments, the attic containment wards, and some minor conveniences." She worked quickly, her efficiency born of practice. The garden gnomes, which had been standing listlessly in the vegetable beds, suddenly scattered, darting away with renewed energy. The self-tending charms on the plants reactivated, and Molly could almost see the magic settling over the garden like morning dew. Finally, Audrey climbed to the attic. They heard her footsteps overhead, heard her voice speaking the incantation. And then, unmistakable and almost welcome, the ghoul let out a long, rattling groan. George laughed, short and startled, but genuine. "I missed that bloody noise," he said. "So did I," Arthur admitted. The ghoul groaned again, louder this time, and began thumping around the attic with enthusiastic abandon. It sounded almost cheerful. Audrey came back down, looking satisfied. "That's everything," she said. She returned to the kitchen and gathered her things, rolling up her parchment and tucking her wand away. All enchantments restored to their previous state. You shouldn't notice any difference from before the audit. "Thank you," Arthur said. "My pleasure." Audrey paused at the door, looking around the kitchen one more time. "You have a lovely home. I hope the 3 days weren't too difficult." They were. Molly hesitated, searching for the right word. "Illuminating." Audrey smiled. "That's one way to put it." She nodded to each of them in turn, then stepped outside and disapparated with a soft crack. The kitchen was silent for a moment. Then the self-stirring pots began to hum. The enchanted bread tin chimed softly, ready to begin its work. The stairs rearranged themselves with a gentle thunk. The temperature-regulating charms adjusted the warmth in the room to exactly the right degree. The burrow was alive again, humming with magic, functioning exactly as it had before. Arthur crossed to the stove and stood looking at it. The burners gleamed, perfectly clean, ready to light at a touch. He didn't light them. Instead, he turned and looked at Molly. "I think," he said slowly, "I'm going to keep chopping firewood." Molly felt something ease in her chest. For the stove. For the stove. I rather liked it. The rhythm of it. Ginny, who had been standing by the window, said, "I'm going to keep fixing things by hand before using magic, just to see if I can." George was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to come down for breakfast every day, even when I don't want to." They all looked at him. "Fred would have wanted me to," George continued, his voice steady. "And I think I need to be here, with you all, not hiding upstairs." Molly crossed to him and pulled him into a hug. He stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, his arms coming up to hold her back. "We want you here too," she whispered. When she pulled back, George's eyes were red, but he was smiling, small and sad, but present. The morning light was filling the kitchen now, warm and golden. The enchanted lamps dimmed slightly, adjusting to the natural light. The dishes were putting themselves away. The floor was sweeping itself clean. Everything was back to normal. But it wasn't, quite. Not really. Molly moved to the cupboard and pulled out the mixing bowl, the regular one, not the enchanted self-mixing version. She set it on the counter and began measuring flour by hand. Arthur watched her. "Making bread? I thought I would, the old-fashioned way. Need help?" "Always." He crossed her side, and together they began measuring and mixing. Ginny joined them, and then George, and the four of them worked together in the warm kitchen, kneading dough by hand, while the enchanted bread tin sat silent in the corner. The house hummed around them, magical and alive and exactly as it had been. But they moved through it differently now, more slowly, more carefully, more aware of what they were holding, what they'd almost lost, what they still had. Ron appeared in the doorway just as they were shaping the dough. "Blimey, is the magic back already?" "Since dawn," Ginny said. He looked around the kitchen, at the self-sweeping floor, the glowing lamps, the humming enchantments. "And you're still making bread by hand?" "We are," Molly said. Ron shook his head, bemused. "You lot are strange." "Probably," Arthur agreed cheerfully. But Ron crossed to the table and sat down, watching them work. And when the bread went into the oven, the regular oven, heated the old-fashioned way, he stayed, waiting with them for it to bake. By the time the sun was fully up, the kitchen smelled of fresh bread, and the Weasleys were gathered around the table, eating breakfast together. The family clock ticked on the wall. The ghoul groaned overhead. The house leaned gently to the left, held upright by magic that had been there so long no one thought about it. Everything was the same. Everything was different. And for the first time in a long time, that felt exactly right. A week had passed since the enchantments returned, and the Burrow hummed with magic once more. The stairs rearranged themselves throughout the day. The dishes washed themselves after meals. The ghoul thumped contentedly in the attic. To any visitor, everything would have looked exactly as it always had. The same crooked house, leaning gently to the left, held together by layers of protective charms and stubborn Weasley determination. But something had shifted. Molly noticed it first on Monday morning when she woke to find Arthur already downstairs, not lighting the enchanted stove, but building a fire in it the old way, arranging kindling with careful attention. She stood in the doorway, watching him work, and said nothing, just smiled and went to fill the kettle. By hand. Tuesday, Ginny spent an hour fixing a loose hinge on the garden gate before even reaching for her wand. The work took longer, required more effort, but when she finished and tested the gate, swinging it open and closed, listening to the smooth, silent movement. Her expression was quietly satisfied. Wednesday, George came down for breakfast. Not just came down, but arrived early before anyone else and started the porridge himself. When Molly entered the kitchen to find him standing at the stove, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon instead of letting the self-stirring charm do the work, she felt her throat tighten. "Morning, Mum," he said, not looking up. "Good morning, dear," she managed. He glanced at her, then, and something passed between them. An understanding that didn't need words. He was here. He was trying. That was enough. By Thursday, the new rhythm had settled into something almost comfortable. The magic was there, humming quietly in the background. But the Weasleys moved through it more deliberately now. They used the enchantments when they needed them, but they didn't rely on them the way they once had. They took time. They paid attention. They noticed things. Friday evening, as the sun began its descent toward the orchard, Molly stood at the kitchen window, watching Arthur in the garden. He was working on a new project, building a trellis for the climbing roses, the old-fashioned way, with wood and nails and a patience she hadn't seen in him in years. She was kneading bread dough, her third batch this week, when she heard voices outside. The back door opened, and Ron stepped through, followed by Harry and Hermione. "Surprise," Ron said, grinning. "We brought reinforcements." Harry was carrying a basket covered with a checked cloth. Hermione held a bottle of wine. Both of them looked around the kitchen with curious expressions, as if expecting to find something different. "Everything all right?" Harry asked. "Ron said there was some kind of ministry thing." "All sorted," Molly said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Just a routine audit. Everything's back to normal now." "Is it, though?" Ron said, looking pointedly at the bread dough. "Because you're still making bread by hand, and Dad's outside using actual tools like some kind of muggle, and George has been down here every morning this week." "We're adapting," Molly said simply. Hermione set the wine on the counter and moved to the window. "It feels different in here," she said thoughtfully. "I can't quite put my finger on it, but something's changed." "Nothing's changed," Ginny said, coming down the stairs. Then she paused, considered, and amended. "Everything's changed." "Both are true," Harry smiled. "That's clearer, thanks." But his eyes were warm, and Molly could see he understood something had shifted, even if he didn't know exactly what. Arthur came in from the garden, saw the visitors, and his face lit up. "Harry, Hermione, wonderful. You'll stay for dinner, of course?" "If we're not intruding," Harry said. "Never," Molly said firmly. She looked around the kitchen, at Ron and Ginny already setting the table, at Hermione pulling vegetables from the basket, at Arthur washing his hands at the sink. "We're just having a simple meal, nothing fancy." "Perfect," Hermione said. George appeared in the doorway, paused when he saw Harry, then came fully into the room. "All right, Harry." "Yeah, you?" George considered the question seriously. "Getting there," he said finally. "Slowly, but getting there." Harry nodded, and something unspoken passed between them. The understanding of two people who'd both lost too much, both survived when others hadn't. Both were still learning how to live with that. They worked together to prepare dinner, not with the frantic efficiency of magic doing most of the work, but with a slower, more deliberate rhythm. Hermione chopped vegetables, Ron peeled potatoes, Ginny stirred the soup, Harry set out plates and glasses. Arthur opened the wine with a corkscrew, not a charm, much to Ron's amusement. And through it all, they talked. Not about the war, not about the audit, just ordinary things. Harry's work at the ministry, Hermione's research project, Ron's new position helping George at the shop, Ginny's upcoming tryout with the Holyhead Harpies, Arthur's latest fascination with Muggle electrical plugs. Comfortable, meandering conversation that went nowhere in particular and meant everything because of it. When dinner was ready, they carried everything out to the porch. The evening was mild, the light golden and soft, and no one wanted to be inside. They arranged chairs and crates and an old wooden bench, creating a mismatched circle in the fading sunlight. Molly ladled soup into bowls. Arthur passed around the bread she'd made by hand, which was slightly uneven, but warm and crusty and perfect. They ate slowly, savoring it, no one rushing. "This is really good, Mrs. Weasley," Harry said. "The bread especially." "Thank you, dear." "Did you make it differently?" Hermione asked. "It tastes, I don't know, more bread-like somehow." Ginny laughed. "More bread-like? You know what I mean. It tastes like it was made by a person, not a charm." "That's because it was," Molly said. "I've been making it by hand this week. No enchantments." "Why?" Ron asked, genuinely curious. Molly looked at Arthur, who smiled and shrugged as if to say, "Your story to tell." "Because," Molly said slowly, "when the enchantments were gone for those 3 days, I remembered something I'd forgotten. That there's value in the doing itself, in the effort and the time and the attention it requires." She paused. "Magic makes things easier, but sometimes easy isn't what we need." Hermione was nodding. "That makes sense, actually. When you have to do something manually, you're more present with it, more aware." "Exactly," Arthur said. He gestured around the porch at the assembled group. "We spent those 3 days learning to slow down, to notice things, to be honest with each other because there was nothing to distract us from what we were feeling. It was hard," Ginny added. "Really hard. But also necessary, I think." George was quiet, turning his glass of wine in his hands. Then he said, "The house was so loud when the magic was gone. Every creak, every groan. It was unsettling at first, but after a while, I realized I could hear other things too. Conversations I'd been avoiding, feelings I'd been pushing down, the space where Fred should have been." The group was silent. "And I thought it would break me," George continued, his voice steady, "facing all of that without any distraction. But it didn't. It just was. The grief was there. The loss was there. And I was still here, sitting in it, breathing through it." He looked up at the assembled group, his family and the people who'd become family. "I'm not saying I'm fixed," he said. "I'm not. But I'm here. And for the first time since the battle, that feels like enough." Harry reached over and gripped George's shoulder. No words, just the pressure of his hand. George nodded, accepting the gesture. Molly wiped her eyes quickly. Arthur cleared his throat and refilled everyone's wine, and they sat together as the sun sank lower, painting the orchard in shades of amber and rose and deep violet. "I have an idea," Hermione said suddenly. "What if we did this regularly? No magic evenings, once a month maybe. We all come here, cook together, eat together, just be together, without rushing, without enchantments doing all the work." "I like that," Ginny said immediately. "Me too," Harry agreed. Ron looked skeptical. "You want to voluntarily give up magic?" Once a month. Not give up, Hermione corrected. Just set aside, for a few hours, to remember what it feels like to do things ourselves. And to make sure we don't lose this, Arthur added, gesturing to the group. This feeling, this awareness. Ron considered, then nodded slowly. All right, but I'm not washing dishes by hand every time. That's where I draw the line. Everyone laughed, and the tension broke into something lighter. They stayed on the porch until full dark, talking and laughing, and occasionally falling into comfortable silence. The stars came out, bright and clear, and the orchard filled with the sounds of evening, crickets and rustling leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl. Eventually, Harry and Hermione rose to leave. Hugs were exchanged, promises made to meet again soon. Ron decided to stay the night, claiming his old room with the casual ease of someone who'd never really left. Molly, Arthur, Ginny, George, and Ron stood on the porch, watching Harry and Hermione disapparate with matching cracks that disturbed the quiet for just a moment before the night settled back into stillness. I like Hermione's idea, Ginny said. The monthly dinners. So do I, Molly said. She looked at George. What do you think, dear? George was quiet for a moment. I think Fred would have liked it. He always said we didn't spend enough time just being a family. Too busy with the shop, with pranks, with everything. Then we'll do it, Arthur said firmly. First Friday of every month. No magic, just us. They went inside together, leaving the chairs scattered on the porch. The kitchen was warm and bright, the enchanted lamps casting their familiar golden glow. The dishes were already washing themselves in the sink, the floor sweeping itself clean. But Molly crossed to the sink and turned off the washing charm. We can do these together, she said. And they did. All 5 of them, standing around the sink, passing dishes and towels, working in comfortable silence punctuated by occasional conversation. When they finished, Ron headed upstairs. Ginny followed a few minutes later. George lingered in the kitchen, looking at the family clock. 8 hands pointing to home. 1 hand frozen, pointing to nowhere. It's still strange, he said quietly, seeing his hand like that. It always will be, Molly said gently. But perhaps that's all right. Perhaps we need the reminder. Of what? That he was here, that he mattered, that the space he left behind is real and valid and ours to feel. George was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed to Molly and hugged her, quickly, awkwardly, but genuine. Thank you, he said, for these 3 days, for making space for all of it. Oh, sweetheart, Molly said, holding him tightly, always. When he pulled back and went upstairs, Molly and Arthur stood alone in the kitchen. The house hummed around them, enchanted and magical and exactly as it had always been. But they moved through it differently now. Arthur put out the lamps one by one, leaving just a single candle burning on the table. Molly banked the fire in the stove. They climbed the stairs together, stairs that adjusted helpfully to their steps, smoothing out the risers, making the climb easy. In their bedroom, Molly stood at the window, looking out at the orchard. The protective wards shimmered faintly in the starlight, invisible to most, but there nonetheless, wrapping the house in safety. Arthur, she said softly. Yes? I'm glad the magic came back, but I'm also glad it left for a while. Arthur crossed to stand beside her, his arms settling around her waist. So am I. They stood together, watching the night settle over their crooked, leaning, beloved home. The Burrow still groaned and creaked, The ghoul still thumped in the attic. The family clock still ticked on the kitchen wall, counting the people who mattered, marking them as home. But now, beneath the hum of enchantments and the whisper of protective charms, the Weasleys carried something else. The memory of 3 days without magic. 3 days of honest work and honest feeling and honest presence with each other. The house remembered, and so did they. Molly turned from the window and climbed into bed. Arthur extinguished the candle with a whispered charm, and darkness settled over the room. Outside, the wards shimmered. The stars turned overhead. The world continued on, vast and complicated and full of both magic and the absence of it. And inside the burrow, the Weasleys slept, held together not just by enchantments and protective spells, but by something quieter, deeper, harder won, by the choice to slow down, to pay attention, to be present with each other, and with the grief and joy and ordinary sacredness of being alive. The house leaned gently to the left. The magic hummed, and all the hands on the family clock, all except one, pointed steadily toward home.